Here in the studio, we're joined by Dr. James Kim, Research Fellow from Asan Institute for Policy Studies, and our reporter Oh Jung-hee. Dr. Kim, Jung-hee, thank you for making time for us today.
Good evening, Daniel.
Right, Jung-hee, let's start with a brief recap of what's been progressing so far.
Well, since the Singapore summit, we can't deny that the negotiations between North Korea and the U.S. have been pretty much stalled up until like October or November. But, starting with North Korean leader Kim Jongun's New Year's address, he expressed that he's willing to sit down with the U.S. president once more, and that actually provided a breakthrough to the stalled nuclear negotiations. So what happened after that was that the nuclear envoys of North Korea, South Korea, and the United States met in Sweden for some working level talks. And then U.S. Special Representative for North Korea, Stephen Biegun, made his way to Pyongyang to meet with his counterpart. And then after that, the summit details, the summit venue, the summit time was decided. And so the working level talks have been continuing in the Vietnamese capital of Hanoi. So they've been continuing their working level talks since February 21st or February 22nd. They've met several times in the Vietnamese capital. What we could see was that their meeting time got shorter and shorter. I mean, yesterday we're thinking that there may have not been working level talks between the two sides, and the day before the meeting was only like 30 minutes long. So we are speculating. Some people actually speculate that maybe the working level delegations were able to narrow down the differences to some extent, and the last bit of the summit declaration is actually left up to the leaders of the two countries, who are to meet in roughly 2 hours' time.
Stephen Biegun and Kim Jongun are the two new additions compared to the last time around. What can you tell us about these two individuals?
Well, Stephen Biegun, he was appointed in mid last year, and he was actually expecting to meet with North Korea's Vice Foreign Minister Choi Sun-hee, who was then his own counterpart, but that actually didn't come true. And Kim Hyok-chol, what happened with him was that he was the former North Korean ambassador to Spain, and he was a figure who was hidden behind the veils. But when Stephen Biegun visited Pyongyang, the U.S. State Department confirmed that his, quote, new counterpart was Kim Hyok-chol, and they confirmed that Kim Hyok-chol was North Korea's new envoy, whose title is North Korea's Special Representative for U.S. Affairs. So the newly appointed figures, they've met for the first time in January in Sweden, for the second time in Pyongyang, and they've continued their working level talks in Hanoi.
Right, Dr. Kim, what do you make of these reshuffle before the all-important summit? We have also seen some minor tweaks before this big event.
Right, so it sounds like North Korea was not happy with the working level talks after the Singapore summit. Maybe there wasn't enough progress being made there, with Choi Sun-hee being the point person. And Kim Jongun wanted to, shift gears a bit, so he brought someone else who's much younger, and a lesser-known face to this negotiation. It'll be interesting whether or not we see any changes here. Stephen Biegun has had some experience on the business side with trade and commerce-related issues in his previous role in the government. But his latest work before his job at the State Department was at Ford. As Vice President of Global Affairs. And he is, I've met him personally on several occasions, very sharp, very well read, and very well soft-spoken, but very, very sharp in what he's able to say. So we got, I think, two very, very sharp guys going at it. And I think it should be interesting whether or not we get any changes here from what we saw in Singapore about 260 days ago.
It seems like there's a lot more pre-summit preparations and exchanges between the working level groups compared to the Singapore summit, which seemed like it happened overnight.
Yeah, though, a lot of people said that there were unannounced working level talks at that time. So it's not clear to me exactly how different it was leading up to the summit, because we haven't heard about all these unannounced meetings that have been occurring. But as Jung-hee pointed out earlier, the change was really in December. There were some unofficial contacts that were being made as early as December when North Korea wanted to, break out of the shell. And then the formal announcement in January with Kim Jong-un's New Year's speech. And then you saw that visit from Kim Yong-chol and Kim Hyok-chol to Washington, D.C. So it's different in some ways, but and we don't have all the information out in the open, so it's kind of difficult to say whether or not it is in fact that different than the first summit.
Dr. Kim, to your knowledge, the system in North Korea is a unique one when it comes to reporting to the higher-ups. Do you think the complicated system or a different system there might have affected the efficiency of talks between the two sides?
Well, that's some of the speculation that have been going on when there were a lot of people sitting down in October and November, in particular in November, trying to figure out what was going on in Pyongyang. Because it wasn't just the potential visit by Kim Jong-un to Seoul that was being talked about towards the end of last year. There was also a scheduled meeting with Xi Jinping. There was a potential meeting with Vladimir Putin that Kim Jong-un was going to be engaging in. Those all got canceled on top of the second summit. So there were a lot of people scratching their heads trying to figure out what was going on in Pyongyang. And we're not sure whether or not it's an administrative issue having to do with the kinds of things that you had mentioned, or it was just North Korea wanting to strategize exactly what they're going to do in the next phase of these negotiations. We'll have to, history will tell many days from now about what exactly was going on in Pyongyang, but we don't have much information there.
For now, the enigmatic style is working to their advantage. Jung-hee, could you trace us back to the situation dating up to the summit? There's been a lot of back and forth with many handwritten letters exchanged. Some speculated it might not happen, and then it happened.
You mean the summit, right?
Right.
Well, yeah, but I mean, it is the leaders of the United States and North Korea will have to sit down for sure once again if they really wanted to make a progress beyond the Singapore summit they reached last year, because when they adopted the Singapore Declaration, there were a lot of criticisms that the declaration itself lacked a lot of details, and especially from the U.S. side, Washington stressed a lot of times that there has to be a progress, that there has to be an advanced agreement that really narrows down to some specific actions that North Korea should take and some even rewards that the U.S. could give in return. So, I mean, back then, actually, if we were to, get ourselves back to 2018, the negotiations between North Korea and the U.S. were pretty much stalled because North Korea first demanded the United States to make a formal end of the war declaration, right? But that didn't happen. The U.S. was not willing to. So North Korea actually changed the strategy. It started to ask for sanctions relief, which the U.S. was not willing to give again. So that's why all that actually led to a deadlock. But after all that, the U.S. is now actually more closer to being able to sit down at a table with North Korea and being able to sort of, make something happen at least. So now the U.S. representative for North Korea, Stephen Biegun, even has mentioned that the U.S. is willing to go simultaneously and in parallel with North Korea. And I think that actually means quite a lot. That's a big change from the U.S. stance last year. So yeah, after all those happenings last year and all that deadlock, the leaders of the two countries will have to sit down for sure once again.
It looks like what didn't break them got them closer together in some sense. Speaking of the end of the war declaration, Dr. James Kim, many experts are anticipating something big will come out of it, more so than the denuclearization efforts in some sense.
So we don't know exactly what's on the agenda even, right? So you have to speculate. And the way that I would do this as someone, who doesn't know, have all the information, you could talk about a range of potential outcomes here. So you got to go from the low to the highest. And we can make a table where, on one side would be North Korea on that ledger on denuclearization. What are some of the steps that they could take towards denuclearization that's meaningful? On the lower rung of the ladder in that category would be what was already discussed, right? Punggye and Dongchangli test sites that were destroyed. We could have verification and inspection of those sites by actual experts instead of just the media. Then you could, then Yongbyon was mentioned in the last Inter-Korean summit. So the question there is, you know, whether or not you could have a full unfettered access to Yongbyon with verification and inspection. And then, you know, during Singapore, the U.S. request was list for list, a full listing account of all the other sites other than Yongbyon, where North Korea is enriching uranium or producing plutonium, and North Korea wasn't willing to give that list up, and you know, a declaration for declaration, right? Declaration of the full accounting of the nuclear material for end of war declaration. But North Korea wasn't able to do that. Maybe they're willing to do that here. We'll see. A full accounting of the weapons of mass destruction other than nuclear weapons. So we're talking about chemical, biological weapons. We haven't talked about that. Full verification, inspection of all of these things. That's a range of different things we can talk about. On the other side of the ledger, on the corresponding steps that the U.S. can take, you can go from the lower rung of the ladder with things like, you know, expanding humanitarian assistance relief for other than, you know, non-American NGOs. So all international NGOs can now have unfettered access for humanitarian assistance into North Korea. You can talk about people-to-people exchanges or cultural exchanges. These are all lower rung of the ladder issues. All the way up until sanctions relief, right? So there are a lot of steps that you can have in there. And end the war declaration is somewhere in the middle there. Certainly, if North Korea takes meaningful steps towards denuclearization, with, let's say, I would say something to the equivalence of a full unfettered access to all sites in Yongbyon, then you might very well get that result. Or something that approaches that in Yongbyon, you might get the end of war declaration on the table from the U.S. So I wouldn't discount that possibility altogether, but I wouldn't also say that it's also on the table, and so that's what we're going to get tomorrow until I see it, right? So we're going to have to wait till what we see, what these two leaders hammer out tomorrow.
Not exactly a low-hanging fruit at this point, the end of war declaration, a very important subject for both Koreas as well as China in some sense. Jung-hee, could you give us a brief outline of what to expect when the two leaders sit down for some dinner and a face-to-face greeting later this evening?
Well, what I should say is the last bit of the summit declaration is actually left up to the leaders. So, you know, I've told you that the working level delegations have met several times in Hanoi, but their meetings got shorter and shorter. So I believe that the last bit, the very critical part of the summit declaration is actually left up to the leaders. And definitely today they'll be, you know, having a one-on-one brief conversation for 20 minutes, and they'll be having a dinner that goes on for 1 hour and 30 minutes. It looks like a very soft schedule from the outside, but if you get into it, you know, President Trump and North Korean leader Kim Jongun will definitely be talking about what measures that they should take in terms of denuclearization and giving rewards. So if I may go deeper into the U.S. corresponding measures, I mean, according to U.S. Special Representative for North Korea who visited Pyongyang earlier this month, he told the South Korean lawmakers that North Korea has been demanding four major things, and that is 1, sanctions relief, 2nd, setting liaison offices, 3rd, resuming inter-Korean economic cooperation. And that is also a very major part of what North Korea wants from the United States. And 4th is the end of war declaration. So these are actually some of the things that North Korean leader and the U.S. president could be talking about, especially in terms of, you know, resuming the inter-Korean economic cooperation. You know how U.S. sanctions on North Korea were actually, you know, some obstacles in terms of South Korea conducting its joint railway and road projects with North Korea at the end of last year, right? It had to go through a lot of consultations with Washington to sort of ease those sanctions, or to get sanctions waivers at least, to get its, you know, infrastructures and whatnot into North Korea. So those things will have to be ironed out between North Korea and the U.S. through this summit, or even before the real one tomorrow, tonight, through their dinner.
Right, speaking of soft schedule, if we focus on soft diplomacy, the first ladies are not a part of this summit, unfortunately. What do we know on that front?
That's right. We were actually, on North Korean state television, we were, actually seeing if North Korean leader Kim Jong-un's wife, Lee Seol-ju, will be accompanying Kim Jong-un, because she actually has a lot of times when Kim Jong-un visited China. So when Kim Jong-un visited China, Kim Jong-un would stand next to Chinese President Xi Jinping, and on to their left and right there would be Lee Seol-ju and Peng Lingyan. But that actually is a scene that we won't be able to see from this North Korea-U.S. summit. But instead of Lee Seol-ju, we are once again seeing Kim Yo-jong, who is North Korean leader Kim Jong-un's younger sister, as well as a very close aide. I mean, we could actually see her, carrying ashtrays for North Korean leader Kim Jong-un. She's a very close aide to Kim Jong-un. So, yep, that is what we can see.
Yes, we could see the two constantly making eye contact and exchanging gestures during the signing ceremony in the last summit as well. Now, going back to the follow-up measures that would be required in terms of North Korea after certain measures are taken from here, I think opening up the regime is very important because it's so close. It's a reclusive state that's hard to get access to. Whether it's inspectors or economic cooperation, they will need to open up a little bit. How do you perceive this happening?
I don't know. And it really depends on how far Kim Jong-un is willing to go and how quickly. Again, I think they were able to, the observation that the working level meetings have been getting shorter and shorter, which, Jung-hee pointed out very nicely, is not that they have an agreement necessarily. I think what that shows is that they were able to narrow the agenda down. And then if you take the subsequent statement from President Trump and Secretary Pompeo, where they were both expressing that denuclearization is a long game, that they're not in any rush for denuclearization, on top of the fact that they're very happy that North Korea is not testing, suggests that they're relatively okay with the current state, which is a de facto freeze for freeze, which is what we're in right now, post Singapore. So was Singapore productive? I think it's productive in the sense that it was able to keep that freeze for freeze. Now, to take it to the next level on denuclearization, I think what President Trump's statement suggests, at least the signals that we're getting, is that this summit is going to be the first step among many steps that's going to come later on, where we're going to get to denuclearization. So, as my colleague would say, one of my colleagues said, there's a 100th step that we need to get North Korea to denuclearize, we're probably talking here about maybe 1 or 2 steps. So we need to temper expectations on this. But again, that's based on the signals coming out of the United States. And that was when President Trump hadn't sit down with Kim Jong-un. So maybe we'll see a better result tomorrow than the expectation going in from the U.S. about what Kim Jong-un is willing to put up on the table and what the U.S. is willing to offer.
One concern stemming from some skeptics of Trump is that he has a tendency to improvise and forget the importance of talking consistent with the documents agreed upon. Do you see that happening again this time? Well,
that's actually what I'm worried about for tonight's dinner, in fact. It's called, I think Sarah Sanders called it the social dinner. A one-on-one 20-minute one-on-one, followed by 1.5 hours of dinner. And the people that that's accompanying him is Pompeo and Mulvaney. Mulvaney doesn't really have expertise on foreign policy issues. So it's interesting who he's bringing to the dinner. What should we expect from these dinners? And the only dinner that I remember that was shocking was the dinner in Mar-a-Lago between Xi Jinping and President Trump, where President Trump served a nice piece of chocolate cake with an announcement that the U.S. Air Force had just bombed airfields in Syria. And that put Xi at a very awkward position, and he didn't know exactly how to respond to that. And it was a psychological ploy, a sort of a move by Trump to try to make Xi uncomfortable and to signal to him that he's on top. Could Donald Trump be playing similar kind of psychological games at tonight's dinner? And could that set the stage for an interesting outcome tomorrow? I think he's capable of that. So yes, he's very unpredictable. That's what makes it interesting for the media, I guess. But it's also what makes it sort of worrisome for people that are watching this and hoping for a good outcome.
Right. We will keep our fingers crossed that there's a method to his unique style, impromptu style.
If I may ask one question to Dr. Kim, I mean, you know, two people accompanying President Trump to the social dinner tonight. One is Secretary Pompeo, but the other one, as you've mentioned, is Mick Mulvaney, who's the acting chief of staff in the White House. But from the North Korean side, there is the top nuclear negotiator, Kim Jong-chul, and the foreign minister, Lee Yong-ho. So these two figures we've seen a lot of times in the nuclear negotiations, but why is U.S. President Trump bringing along with him the acting chief of staff, who we've not seen many times in the nuclear negotiations, when he could have brought Stephen Biegun, for example?
Yeah, that's an interesting question, and it shows that President Trump doesn't really care about sort of, you know, what the other side, who these people are. And it could be, on the one hand, a sign of confidence. Maybe he knows these guys inside out. He doesn't need another advisor in there. But it could also be that he wants to be in there and he doesn't want someone to, you know, signal an opposition to whatever he says or does. He wants a loyalist in that room. And both of these guys are very much a pro-Trump loyalists. So maybe he wants to signal a sign of power, just like Kim Jongun is doing, to show that he's on top, perhaps. That could be what's going on. But also in Singapore, all the important meetings, the then chief of staff, you know, John Kelly, was sitting in these rooms. So it's unclear to me why the chief of staff are sitting in all of these meetings, but again, it was his choice, and again, I frankly don't know what's going on inside that head. I'd love to know, but it's a mystery to me.
Similarly enigmatic are these two leaders sitting down for talks in a short while. Jung-hee, we place a lot of emphasis on North Korea trying to gain recognition as a normal country, and it looks like Kim Jong-un managed to pull that off, according to some analysts, with his arrival in Hanoi, in Vietnam.
That is true. I mean, you know, what we saw at the Singapore summit was that Kim actually continuously tried to expose himself. He didn't want to remain as a reclusive leader. He, you know, went out to sites. He went out to the skyscrapers in Singapore. He took selfies with the top officials in Singapore. And maybe we could expect that once again in Vietnam. Well, you know, on his journey to Hanoi, he actually took his special train that his grandfather took, following the legacy of the founder of the regime. But once he's in Hanoi, you know, we saw him moving a lot of times. We saw him waving at people. So, yeah, he's once again trying to, you know, portray himself as a normal leader, increasing the exposure of himself to the general public.
Right. On that note, Dr. James Kim, before we let you go, finally, North Korean leader Kim Jong-un, he has been known to push for a change. But how genuine is his push for economic reform and such?
Yeah, that's the question that everybody's asking. If he is genuine, then he's serious about denuclearization, because that's the condition that the U.S. is laying out there. If you denuclearize, then we will help you develop. And did Kim Jong-un take that message to heart? If we look at his schedule for this summit, he is taking this trip to Vietnam seriously, because he's going to be staying 2 extra days touring the country. Why? Because the Americans have laid out that vision that Vietnam can essentially be North Korea's future. And Kim Jong-un can see for himself and experience what North Korea's future would look like while he's in Vietnam. Vietnam is one of few countries like China that haven't democratized. It's a communist state, and it's been able to open up economically and develop. Kim Jong-un, it should be interesting whether or not Kim Jong-un gets a good experience out of this. As I recall, historically, when Deng Xiaoping visited Singapore, from what we hear, it was at Singapore that he decided that he was going to make that change in China, that he was going to open up economically. And so can Vietnam be what Singapore was to Deng Xiaoping? Can Vietnam be what it was for Kim Jongun. So again, we'll have to wait and see.
Well, what I want to add on to this is that, I mean, President Trump has explicitly said that this morning through his tweet. He was like, you know, Vietnam is a great economic powerhouse. Its potential is awesome, and that is an example that North Korea can follow. So that is a very explicit message, a very clear message from U.S. President Trump, who has to meet with North Korean leader Kim Jongun. And what we have to note is that North Korea also sent its foreign minister to Hanoi in December last year. He was there to learn from Vietnam's Doi Moi economic reform. He visited technology parks. He visited some agricultural study academic center or places like that. And what we saw today was North Korean delegation made up of, you know, the international affairs expert plus a core economy figure visiting some industrial facilities in Vietnam, like for example, Haiphong and Ha Long Bay as well. Well, North Korea has been, you know, wanting to boost its tourism sector, which is directly related to their visit to Ha Long Bay. It's a very famous tourist site in Vietnam. And plus, they visited Haiphong, which is an industrial port town, and which is home to some South Korean companies, which has a lot of foreign direct investment coming in. So those are some of the signs that North Korea is actually willing to learn from Vietnam. And during the 2 days that North Korean leader is staying, in addition to the period for his North Korea-U.S. summit, he may be actually making his way to these sites, and he may actually be, you know, visiting the Samsung Electronics smartphone factory in Bắc Ninh province as well. So those kind of things, if we see, could mean that North Korean leader Kim Jong-un is genuinely willing to learn from the economic development experience that Vietnam could go through while maintaining its communist political system.
Right, but at the same time, although that's as much as we would like to hope that that's the case, there is the issue, the subject of legacy, following his grandfather's footsteps, being in Vietnam. Could that be something that's bigger than actual devotion to economic reform? Because there is a possibility that North Korea takes pride in being its own unique identity with its willingness to become, eagerness to become recognized as a nuclear state.
Right. So there are two issues you're raising. On the one hand, I think Kim Jong-un has the agenda to sort of trace back the kind of similar kind of experience that Kim Il-sung had while he was in Vietnam, to project himself as the modern-day Kim Il-sung. On the other hand, the question of whether or not he's in fact going to give up that nuclear weapon, and if he's going to open up, how is he going to open up? I think the more likely scenario here is that a lot of experts are saying that Kim Jong-un is not going to give up his nuclear weapon easily, but there could be controlled opening. And we're seeing some of that, right? In Rajan, we saw that experience in Kaesong Industrial Complex. So could we have more openings, more restricted trade areas within North Korea where foreign investments can go in and allow for a growth? And as a result of those great experiences, North Korea decides to increase the number of opened areas. Again, there are many possibilities here, but we don't know for sure until these results, until the agreements are hammered out, and we take a look at what these agreements really are.
Right. Thank you for your time, Dr. James Kim, and Jung-hee, thank you so much for your insights as well.
Pleasure.